My name is Laurie. I am the Director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, just south of the border. And I'm joined by my co-chair, Solomon Wong, the CEO and President of InterVISTAS Consulting. So every year, the border session is meant to take stock of what's been happening at the border, how the visions of our respective agencies are evolving, and of course, how we are working together to improve border efficiency and security. And I really appreciated this morning the ambassador's comments that perhaps the most productive thing we can do these days is really sort of celebrate and recognize our everyday accomplishments. And so that's something we'd like to do today in this session, is to recognize some of these things that we've been achieving on the border over the last year or so, and then what we're sort of looking forward to in the future. The Canada-US border continues to be a dynamic platform for innovation, collaboration between our two countries. And in the session today, we will highlight some recent advancements in securing and facilitating cross-border flows, including biometrics and preclearance, even as new challenges and areas of misalignment emerge. We will hear from current and previous leaders of both governments to share insights into lessons learned from a cooperative border approach with an eye to a long-term trajectory of where we are going. So we will start with virtual remarks from Nina Patel, the Regional Director General of the Pacific Region with Canada Border Services Agency, followed by Brittny Valdez, Chief of Staff for the Port of Blaine with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, sitting in for Harmeet Gill, who is the Port Director there. And then we will move to a fireside chat with Denis Vinette, the Executive Consultant for InterVISTAS and former Vice President of the Travelers Branch of CBSA, and Deborah Meyers, the CEO of NKS Insights and former Director of Canadian Affairs at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Then finally, we will wrap up with some comments from Samir Esmail from InterVISTAS. A reminder that complete speaker bios are on the Whova app, and if you'd like to submit questions, Solomon and I will try to monitor those, and even if we do not have time to address them today, we will do our best to address them even after the session has ended. So it perhaps goes without saying that this is very interesting times for the Canada-US relationship, and that is certainly the case on the border as well. We've seen significant drops in cross-border travel since 2024. In terms of the land border, we're down around 20% in cross-border travel. That does seem to be stabilizing. We've actually seen a little bit of a rebound in cross-border travel this past spring. But I think that we are sort of in a new normal. And I was struck by, I think it was Dan's comments in the last session that I myself, I'm sort of sympathetic to this feeling like waiting for it to get back to normal, waiting for us to get back to the way things were. And I'm starting to realize that I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I think we move forward and we have a new scenario that we are faced with. Air travel is also down between the two countries, particularly for Canadians returning from the United States, been down around 15%. But the flip side of that is that US travel to Canada in air mode is up 10%. So it's a little bit of a wash in the air mode. Regardless, there are businesses, particularly in border communities, that are really impacted by this shift in cross-border travel. And I think even up here in Edmonton, in northern Alberta, where we're far from the land border and perhaps a little bit more insulated from those changes, that border still drives many aspects of our economic health and our social connections. And that does vary considerably by region. So at the same time we're facing these headwinds, we are seeing some major accomplishments in the cross-border space. We had the expansion of preclearance to the Billy Bishop Airport in Toronto, and the first ever rail preclearance operation opened up in Vancouver, Grand Pacific Central Station, and that happened right before the FIFA World Cup games came to Seattle and Vancouver. So that was an incredible milestone for our region, for cross-border travel. Before preclearance was put in place, you'd take the Amtrak train from Vancouver and it would actually stop at the border, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection would board the train. And I can speak from personal experience that that created a lot of unanticipated delays, and it was difficult to rely on that train as a cross-border service. Now all of that work is done before the train ever leaves the station. So we have successfully hosted the FIFA World Cup Games. Of course, not just in North America, but also in our region. Vancouver and Seattle were the only cities that were adjacent to the international border. And there were many of us in this Pacific Northwest economic region who really came together over the last I think it was almost 2 years, right? Every other week to really prepare for those games. And I think that's really a testament to how we can continue to work together. So we'll hear a little bit more about some of that planning for FIFA later on in the session. But I think as a region and in the spirit of Penwar, we can really take this opportunity to take those relationships and that goodwill that we saw surrounding FIFA and keep that coordinated problem solving going, because it really does speak to our ability to maintain trust, connectivity in spite of some pretty significant headwinds. So I will turn it over to Solomon now, and we will hear from our virtual speakers.
Thanks very much, Laurie. And I think in terms of the Penwar region, one of the things that's important to the themes of our conference is we are the hotbed of innovation for border resilience and ideas. Listening to the ambassador speak this morning around the successes of being able to align Canadian and US border measures associated with Ebola, as well as other areas to highlight cooperation, while obviously the relationship is changing in terms of the trade and travel dynamic. But at the heart of this, we have more preclearance than any other region in North America. Some of the things that will also proceed ahead that may not be immediately obvious around some of the strong working relationships between countries, between private sector and public sector, and some of the things that Penwar is most known for in terms of being able to stimulate different kinds of ideas. Just coming off of our last panel, somebody was talking about the confidence level of being able to ensure that businesses can get an engineer going from north to south or south to north. These are critical things that we have a history of looking at problems and then coming up with solutions that can go into proof of concept to potentially being deployed across North America. I just came back from 2 back-to-back trips to Europe, and I can say with confidence that the world is also looking at what we're able to do as 2 countries. For anybody who's been to Europe and experienced a certain amount of delay, sometimes it could be just 5 minutes, other times it could be 5 hours. And that experience of how do you actually get biometrics working between different countries, but also modes of transportation, that's something that we hope thematically we'll be able to explore more, not just for today's session, but also for other kinds of things that could be kickstarters for different ideas that could be implemented and scaled forward. As Laurie mentioned, we've got our first segment associated with just hearing from CBSA and CBP associated with just a number of baseline updates of things that have been advanced. So I'm going to turn this over and welcome Nina Patel, Regional Director General, and her extensive experience of being able to look at different problems and work with stakeholders in a collaborative manner. Over to you, Nina, for your remarks.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here today with you. My name, as Solomon said, is Nina Patel, and I'm the Regional Director General of the Pacific Region for the CBSA. The Pacific region expands approximately 1.4 million square kilometers, covering both BC and the Yukon. It covers the most northerly staff port, staff port in the country. The Pacific region has over 1,000 uniform employees. It's probably about 1,400 employees working at 43 land, air, rail, and marine ports of entry. The region, this is just for situational awareness as we move forward. The region includes one of 3 international mail centers, so the other ones are in Montreal and Toronto. The country's 3rd busiest airport, as well as Canada's largest marine port, container exam facility, and cruise ship terminal. The region is also home to several of the busiest land border crossings. Additionally, Pacific region is one of 3 regions in the country with an immigration holding center and one of 2 regions that have all modes of traffic in all business lines. As you may be aware, we provide integrated border services that support not just national security, public safety priorities, but we need to ensure that we're also looking for the facilitation of both persons and goods. It's a really exciting time to be part of the overall public safety portfolio. Canada's border is strong, and we're making it stronger. In 2024, the Government of Canada made their commitment very clear through Canada's border plan, which is the largest single investment in the border in Canadian history. It is backed by $1.3 billion to bolster border security, strengthen our immigration system, and contribute to Canada's overall prosperity. So what does that actually mean to us? For regional operations, we're increasing our front lines and ensuring they have the tools and technology needed to continue to interdict illicit drugs and illegal firearms, which are our focus on the good side of things. And we continue to tackle cross-border crime, drug trafficking, irregular migration, including targeting organized crime groups. The work is done in collaboration with different law enforcement agencies across Canada and federal departments, and through ongoing dialogue between Canada and the US on strategic and operational border policy issues. Canada's border plan specifically allocates $355 million for the CBSA. However, this has not been a one-time investment. Since the announcement of the border plan, Canada has invested more than $600 million for hiring of over 1,000 additional CBSA personnel. This does not include investments of similar magnitude into the RCMP and the Canadian Coast Guard, which also plays a role in border security and maritime domain awareness. Within the CBSA, the federal government's commitment will be seen especially in marine and commercial operations, which supports larger efforts by the government to diversify the Canadian economy. CBSA's mandate is complex, and we have to ensure that while we work to enforce the legislation at our borders, we are not an impediment to trade coming into Canada, or going out for that matter. Next slide, please. In the lead up to the 2026 FIFA World Cup, Pacific Region stood up a dedicated regional task force to support the agency with the necessary planning and preparations to ensure we help deliver a successful tournament while ensuring our safety and security mandates were met. I've worked in many regions throughout my career and can confidently say that one of the greatest strengths that I've seen in the Pacific region is in the relationships with both our internal and external partners, which were all built over time. The FIFA World Cup is a perfect example of this. The CBSA played an integral role in facilitating the movement of international travelers, strengthening border security, managing the risks, and coordinating with government partners and industry in preparation for the world's largest sporting event. We recognize that our role in enabling major events like the FIFA World Cup extend beyond the economic benefits. Our success is also reflected in the cultural impact these events have on communities. Because of the strong working relationships with partners, such as the airport authorities, Department of Transport, government agencies, and our law enforcement community, we were able to leverage established lines of communications to quickly and effectively manage real-time challenges and allowed for an integrated approach in balancing both border security with efficient facilitation. Next slide, please. Borders don't exist in isolation, and by the very nature, they require partnerships. Whether you live in Canada or in the US, it's imperative that we continue to work collaboratively with international and domestic partners to effectively balance tourism and economic prosperity with our joint enforcement mandates. CBSA is working with Transport Canada and Global Affairs Canada to ensure that the agency is positioned to support trade expansion efforts underway by the Government of Canada, including how to leverage digital investments in new technologies. CBSA has also recently revitalized its standing industry consultative body to ensure that it is not only being transparent with industry, but also working with it on solutions. There are further efforts underway to reduce impacts on Canadian businesses and travelers, working with federal partners to reduce at-the-border regulatory requirements and make the process easier and faster while maintaining safety and security. The CBSA continues to invest in technology to facilitate people and goods. For example, pick machines in the traveler mode, which have significantly reduced the processing time of passengers, and detection tools and technology that allows us to clear large amounts of goods without impeding trade. Next slide. Don't worry, last slide. The way forward. So we can all agree that the pace of change today is like nothing we have ever seen before. That is why, as an agency and as a region, it's been critical to remain agile and become comfortable being uncomfortable. I'm proud of the way the Pacific region continues to thrive on collaboration and resilience. When faced with these new challenges, we come together with open minds, diverse perspectives, and a shared commitment to finding solutions. Regardless of how much is going on every day, the truth is, when we break it down, our core mandate has not changed. Our teams continue to be ready for whatever new challenges come up, and we have proven time and time again that we can be successful. And FIFA, the focus of the presentation today was going to be a lot on FIFA, but it's such a small part that I want to go a bit more into the other areas. So I'll just end on that. Solomon?
That's great, Nina. And I think in terms of some of the themes of what we've heard so far here in Edmonton is the degree to which energy, artificial intelligence, trade, the collaborative relationship, these are definitely areas that dovetail nicely on some of your thoughts on where things will go to volumetrically, as well as the kinds of challenges that we're going to face mutually for both Canada and the United States. Maybe a question for you in terms of reflections around when you look into the future for our region, and understanding the Pacific region is certainly the diversity of different modes and kind of the kind of nature of traffic that you've shared. Where do you think would be one key opportunity and challenge you would provide to our audience, which is a good mix of private and public sector folks?
Okay, so I've been with CBSA for over 30 years, and I don't think I've ever experienced so much attention of at the border. You see it on the news, we see it in government speeches, and the positive is that everyone is talking about the border, but also the negative could be everyone's talking about the border, and so that comes with a lot of pressure. But in all seriousness, there's a lot of opportunities right now, and the keys is going to be that our mandate has not changed. So we need to be able to now capitalize on the fact that people understand the border a little bit more now. We're getting significant investments in the border through officers, but also technology. But the expectation of the public is that we, as public servants and through the Government of Canada's commitments, continue to look at opportunities to grow our economy. And that's how do we fit in to not impede, but also how do we continue to keep Canadians safe by focusing on our enforcement updates. So that's all going to be, it just gets more and more difficult, as you were talking about, with new trade chain corridors, introduces new risks, with a lot of the stuff going around the world, chaotic at times. Migration of people from different areas based on different conflicts is also top of mind. But CBSA, regardless of your thinking just towards commercial or just people at the airport, we tend to be involved in a number of different ways. A lot of people saw the news releases last week out of the FBI out of California with extortion. You know, CBSA plays a big part in that, and then that's the government's commitment into our immigration systems. So I would suggest the opportunities is that we'll finally, we have those investments we talked about. We're empowered to take risks, look at different ways of doing business. Our mandate's the same. It's most of the stuff that we actually, those of us that have been around for a long time, want to do, and that's the enforcement side of the work. But in the flip side, we need to make sure that from an economic perspective that we're not in any way impeding the supply chain or in any way an impediment to the progress that Canada's making in that space. I'll just leave it at that, I think, Solomon.
Yeah, appreciate your insights. And so what we're going to do now is shift gears a little bit from Nina's observations and reflections on near-term priorities and move to Brittny Valdez, who is the supervisory CBP officer for the Blaine Port of Entry, subbing in for Area Port Director Gill. Thank you very much, Brittny, for stepping in. And I think just to give you a flavor of the conversation, quite eager around your thoughts and remarks around different things you've observed, but also sharing with you that earlier we heard from the Port of Vancouver, just sheer excitement about what has been done on facial recognition at cruise ports. Nina just talked about primary inspection kiosks for the Canadian version at airports around being able to process folks. But maybe I'll turn it over to you for some thoughts around things you would like to share from your perspective. Over to you, Brittny.
Awesome. Thank you, Solomon. Happy to be here with you guys. Unfortunately, Mr. Gill's out today, so he asked me to cover. So I found out about this presentation last night, so I do apologize if I jump around a little bit. We do have some more innovations here at the port. Like Solomon had mentioned, we recently got our facial biometrics system installed in our pre-primary lanes. Installation began roughly the last week of April, beginning of May, and it was finalized by the end of May. We are able to issue I-94s for non-immigrants that require I-94s in pre-primary. Like with every change, it was a little bit of a learning curve, but we're slowly getting more and more issued on pre-primary, especially for those ones that also prepay in advance. It saves them getting sent into secondary inspection. So overall, the primary timing has increased slightly, but overall in their total inspection time, it has reduced it quite a bit.
Great. And I think chatting a little bit with Port Director Gill around just the number of places that have deployed this. I understand CBP's only land border facility is currently at Blaine. Is that right?
That is correct. Our facial biometric program on a national level began in 2018, and they were slowly rolling out. Typically, they go to the major airports. That's where a lot of our kiosks are. I'm assuming they're similar to the ones that Ms. Patel had talked about in Vancouver. I personally haven't seen it, so I'm not too sure how to describe it. But they typically go to the airports first, and then for the northern border with this specific technology, Blaine was the first for it to get rolled out.
Yeah, for those of you who haven't experienced it or gone across a land border, maybe if you can describe from a passenger's perspective, what should they expect?
It's almost like a paparazzi. Even for me coming in initially, it caught me off guard because the light is a little bit brighter because it is a more updated camera, so it captures it quicker, and the technology and the lighting in there does tend to be a little bit brighter because we try and get, especially for up here in the Pacific Northwest with the cloudy days at nighttime. So upon coming up to our RPMs, which is our X-ray technology, they're right at the initial point of the pre-primary, it'll take your photo, and then in the system, it runs it through the facial biometric portion of it to see if you either have a passport on hand, if you've crossed before. If it successfully identifies your photo, it'll put you into your travel package. So by the time you make it to the officer booth, he already sees your picture, sees the crossing history, and any other details that pop up with your traveler profile. If there's no discrepancies or no other additional reason to send you in, such as agriculture, or if you need to pay a fee of some sort, they can admit you right there on primary again, but they've already essentially got your travel history solely based on your facial match or mismatch depending on how well the photo came out.
No, congratulations on that. I think having some time savers for folks is really an important part, but also measurably improving fidelity of just being able to understand who's coming through, as well as just being able to make better use of secondary.
Yes.
Yeah. Any reflections? We had heard what Nina Patel indicated around the CBSA preparations for FIFA. Any observations you'd like to also pass along to our group before we move to one question that we've got on HUVA?
Our FIFA preparation was very similar to the way Ms. Patel described. We actually worked closely with their FIFA task force team. I was, I don't know, fortunate or unfortunate to be leading the FIFA task force for the CBP side. On our end, we try to do traffic projections out. That was the basis of our methodology and preparation for our staffing, our budget, resources, equipment, emergency management systems. A lot of it centered around our traffic. In Seattle, we had 6 games, and then Vancouver had 7. So we didn't have as many games to prepare for, but we had a little bit of that residual effect from the Canadian side, in addition to the 2 major holidays. For the 4th of July week, that was our busiest week overall for the FIFA period. For the roughly 4 weeks, we were just shy of 800,000 travelers. What was surprising for us is our bus traffic increased by nearly 30%. We had 2 major Australian groups as well as the Qatari delegation that came through. So that not caught us off guard. We were in preparations with the stakeholders and the POCs for both of those groups, but it was a change in our resources a little bit from what we initially planned, just to help adjust for that workload.
Great. Before I turn it back to Laurie to move to our second segment, we have one question from the HUVA app. Nina spoke earlier about the case that came forward from California with the Bishnoi gang, but there's also an aspect around a much longer history of cooperation. One person asked a question around, can you characterize any results or any tangible items around just the value of cooperation between agencies, for either yourself, Brittny, or Nina?
I can speak for CBP. I know ever since Mr. Gill has taken over becoming port director from the previous director, and Border Patrol also, well, Mr. Vasquez is now our head agent in charge of Border Patrol, but prior to him leaving the Blaine area, our relationships have increased greatly amongst Border Patrol, HSI, state and locals, as much as they're able to within their regulations. I've only been in this agency and in Blaine for roughly 8 years, but in this time it's drastically improved. We get a lot of support, especially from the Canadian side now. We saw it a lot with FIFA working closely with CBSA and RCMP. When I initially started with this agency, a lot of that wasn't there, or the communications was really delayed. To where now, I think similar with this case that she spoke with out of California, we're able to get these conversations go on a more adequate timeline rather than having to drag it out or go through third parties. We've built that rapport with each other to have daily communications if needed.
Great. Well, I'll ask the audience to do a round of applause for both Nina and Brittny. And I'll turn it over to Laurie for the second segment of our session on borders. Over to you, Laurie.
Thanks, Solomon. And we'll have Denis and Deborah come up to the stage. And this is a really fun opportunity for me to talk to 2 of the people that I feel like are just the best positioned people I could imagine to talk about some of the successes we've had on the border and from our respective countries, some of the challenges, opportunities, frustrations, and lessons learned, because I think it's a really valuable time to be thinking about what did we get right in the past, what can we move forward, and maybe what didn't work that we need to do differently. So I'm going to ask a few questions. Maybe we could monitor the Whova just in case we get a few more. You've got it. And so I'll start by asking each of you, who I feel like I've known Deborah my whole life, even though I haven't. And Denis, I think we first met during the COVID times when we were sort of like figuring things out as they were happening, right? And it was a very challenging time. But if you could each take a few minutes to just reflect on the work you did in your previous roles when you were still with government and speak a little bit to how that cross-border relationship works, because it may not be obvious to many people in the room. So Deborah, you want to go first?
Oh, it's already on. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Deborah Meyers. Really pleased to be here at the Penwar Annual Summit. It's probably one of my favorite meetings that I used to go to each year when I was at the Department of Homeland Security. Many thanks to Penwar, to Laurie and Solomon for inviting me to join this panel, and thrilled to be here with Denis. He and I have seen each other at a lot of meetings over the years. So in terms of my background, I spent the last 15 years of my career as the Director of Canadian Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. My first job right out of college actually was with the government as well, with an immigration commission. So I've been doing borders and migration and North America really for over 30 years. In between my two government stints, I spent a decade at two different policy research institutes in Washington, D.C., including working with the founder of the Border Policy Research Institute, which Laurie now leads. I come to this honestly. I grew up along the border. I'm from Michigan originally, so grew up in the Detroit, Windsor area, went to summer camp in Canada, class field trips were often to Canada. So I really truly understand the cross-border dynamic, although I could not have predicted that I would end up going down this path. And some of the items that I worked on when I was at the Department of Homeland Security helped create the Beyond the Border initiative, which someone mentioned earlier, and was in charge of making sure it got implemented for the U.S., as well as worked on supporting some North American leader summits, the Vancouver 2010 Olympics, and of course, the Land, Rail, Marine, Air preclearance agreement, just to hit a few highlights. You asked us to talk a little bit, Laurie, about how the cross-border relationship works. And I think my perspective at DHS was that the best way to achieve our goals and our mission set was by working with our Canadian partners. Really felt like we couldn't do it alone. We're looking at continental security, protecting both our countries. And that means working together at the earliest point to prevent potentially harmful goods and people from entering our continent. And so the United States can't do that alone. It takes collaboration with the federal government of Canada. It takes collaboration with state and local law enforcement, provincial officials. It takes cooperation with the private sector, with owners and operators. So despite different processes in our governments, I think that's really the way that it worked best. And there was daily contact. I actually knew the phone number of my Canadian colleagues better than some of my American colleagues because I was calling them all the time. They were calling me all the time during the day, but also nights and weekends and holidays, which is usually when, as Denis will attest, most incidents occur, not during business hours. Standing working groups, regular leadership engagements at all levels, from the ambassador to cabinet secretaries all the way down to the working level. And the last thing I'll say in terms of the cross-border relationship, which is often a surprise to people, you hear about the asymmetry between the US and Canada, the United States being so much larger. But I will tell you, there were few meetings that we ever had with Canadian officials where we, the United States, were not outnumbered by Canadian officials who came to the table with many, many experts and very, very deep knowledge.
Maybe we have a bit of an inferiority complex. And so we just figured we come in numbers, maybe we can get our way. They're really great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Any day that starts with a shot of whiskey is a great day. So we've asked that this session close with another shot.
There's a lot of them left. So.
Yeah. And I do love my Basil Hayden Kentucky bourbon, so I miss it, just to say. I was fortunate that I became an accidental customs inspector when I came out of university. I had never crossed the border in my life, never had kind of given thought that this is the career. I was thinking I was going to go into policing, maybe corrections. But I found quickly that, whether accidental or not, that was my niche. It's what I enjoyed. And it just grew from there. And so I never left the Canada Border Services Agency. I worked in 3 departments, but it was always the same, that just kind of transition through the 32 years that I spent there, and joined the management stream, and was fortunate that at the time that I retired, I was a senior assistant deputy minister for our travelers programs and operations. And before that, we had a different structure at the agency where I was the associate vice president for our national operations coast to coast across all modes. So really saw the evolution not only of the border and the Canadian border itself and the triggers that led to some of the transformation that we've seen over the last several decades, but also saw the evolution of that relationship with our U.S. colleagues. So to Deborah's point, in my last 5 years, I had the opportunity to work with 3 executive assistant commissioners of OFO, right? And I'll just name them: Todd Owen, Bill Ferreira, Pete Flores, and Diane Sabatino, who's still in post. And to your point, I had their number. They were on speed dial, and they would call me on a moment's notice. Todd and I launched together when COVID suddenly hit. We saw it through with Bill and Pete. Pete was promoted to associate or assistant commissioner, started working with Diane, and with Diane, it was just kind of the day-to-day. And so when you hear about relationships between Canada and the US, I would say there's probably 3 levels, and I'll be happy to come back to that. We hear and we see in the media the public and political relationship, and that often driven by the governing administration on either side of the border. In behind that is a separate track, which is the senior government officials and non-elected officials who need to make sure that the direction being provided by the elected officials is actually being pursued, but that it's done through collaboration with, in our case, Canada and the US. And then ultimately, the third track is your practitioner. So it's your officer in a port of entry, it's your FBI agent, it's your RCMP officer, who, they will maintain those relationships. They will make sure that they continue to be fruitful in terms of the pursuit. And I think those are the ones that need to be kind of understood and protected. And to some extent, working to kind of educate in some instances, both, whether it's industry partners, other public sector partners, or the general public, so that they don't get lost in, the media headlines versus what really happens, I'll say, below the surface, which has always been strong and continues to grow as I talk to my colleagues.
Yeah, it's a great point. And on that note, you probably all can't see this from down there, but Deborah has socks that have US and Canadian flags on them. So you're really walking the walk there. So Denis, let's start with you. Talk about CBSA a little bit. And Nina sort of actually addressed this in her comments. There's a lot of changes for CBSA. The mandates haven't changed, but the resources have, I think, $350 million, over 1,000 new agents or officers. And CBSA has come out of a slightly tumultuous time. If any of you remember ArriveCan, that was the app that was mandatory for a while during COVID. You put your information in it before you cross the border. I actually thought it was genius because it was, to my knowledge, the first time that you were collecting this advanced passenger information at the land border, but it had a lot of kinks that, didn't really get worked out. We'll put it that way. So, there's this pressure to innovate, as Nina had said, but there's still this mandate. Where does CBSA go from here, given sort of where they've been, and then this new focus on the border, which really does feel like a new terrain for the Canada-US border?
Well, regretfully, you have to seize an opportunity when it presents itself. And some are, dreadful in nature. And I will suggest that in Canada, that has typically been what has driven kind of the prioritization of the border, some of the investments of money leading to some of the transformation that we've seen. I will go back to when I sat in that booth back on 22nd of June, 1992, when I started. And it was all paper, pencils, and pens, right? There was no technology. My terrorist watch list was actually a book that, if I had a name and I suspected, I had to kind of leaf through and see if that name was in there, to what they have today, which is so far removed from that experience. And in 1994 is when the CBSA started to install its first license plate readers in lanes at the border. And that was kind of began the evolution, if you will, of what we see today as kiosks in airports and what have you. But it was really triggered by, the first big wave was post 9/11. We needed to work on Fortress North America. The continent in the US specifically was under attack. And so we could not be the weak link. And we had been working on some strategies to invest in border and border fluidity that, made it such that when the money became available, we were ready to pursue that. But then the positive that came from that was things like the Smart Border Declaration and the Security and Prosperity Partnership that was established, which was just indicative of how this was being planned and addressed and aligned between Canada and the US. It's allowed the CBSA to continue to advance its investment in technology and change the passenger experience. We've largely seen it in air. I think it's the one that's the most advanced. Land has had its advancement as well. We only rolled out document readers at the CBSA in the mid 2015, like around that period. And it wasn't even mandatory at that time to present your passport, right? And so the security angle, the awareness of who is crossing, capturing that information, just rolling that out came as a result of continued investments that came by national efforts. So where the CBSA finds itself today, which is, a really great position to be in, is that just prior to COVID, we had been working, and my team was leading on a traveler modernization vision. And when COVID hit, it was like, okay, we need a better way to work at the border and we need new investments. And because, again, we were kind of ahead of a global event occurring, we were able to access funds to bring, the next wave of investments forward. And so, the CBSA now has a policy cover. It has the money beyond the investment that Nina referred to actually invest in traveler modernization. So a different traveler experience and a different officer experience, because we want the officer to be enabled as well. And they did the same with commercial. And so rolling out the accounting portion. So the CBSA for the last many years rolled out cargo reporting through eManifest. Then we had to work with other partner departments, so OGDs, so automate their processes through single window initiative. And now the accounting has come along. So now the entire continuum has been digitized. It's coherent and it works. So I think they're well positioned for that. ArriveCan, close real quick on that. We actually had the ArriveCan application under development. And that's why we were able to bring it quick to market. I will say that, to the CBSA's defense, if you go to their website, they'll break out the $60 million that the Auditor General spoke about. The actual app was not $60 million. There's a lot of investments in supporting what was a COVID response. So the ArriveCan application kind of became the face of, the displeasure with Canada's COVID measures. But what it did demonstrate is that we could work at speed. We can hit the market. We could not improvise, but roll out new initiatives in a pretty quick manner. We received information and really enabled officers to be able to have the information at the tip of their fingers for quick decision making. So I hope that that is a lesson learned both for the government and the CBSA in terms of what's next and how we move forward.
Deborah, you mentioned in your opening comments about how policy implementation takes a long time. Preclearance expansion is a good example of that. I think the LRMA was 2016, 2015. So it's been 10 years and we're finally seeing these operations come online. So tell us a little bit more, you were involved in that process as well, but just about the process and if there are other successes that are ongoing but less visible, maybe to Denis' earlier point that there's this feeling like, oh, the Canada-US relationship is so fractured, but the working relationships are still strong. We just don't always see them, even though we often benefit from them. So.
Oh, that's right. And thanks for asking about that, Laurie. And I will say regarding the socks, they were actually a gift from colleagues at the Canadian Embassy in the United States. So appreciated that. And it's great to have an opportunity to wear them where people hear about it. At home, they don't get that much notice, So I think it would be difficult for people to imagine all the steps that take place when in terms of negotiating and then getting an agreement into implementation. I mean, first there's thinking about the idea, which actually was in 2011 as part of the Beyond the Border Initiative and Action Plan, this idea of updating the preclearance agreement to reflect the post 9/11 world and to be able to expand to other modes, because the original agreement was only air. It started in 1952, but then there was a 2001 air preclearance agreement. So it was pretty radical to think about doing preclearance in other modes. So starting about 2010, 2011 discussions, negotiating from 2012 to 2015, an agreement gets signed, and then the government of Canada changed from the conservative government to the liberal government. And as I think occurs in many governments around the world, when a government changes, the new government comes in and says, well, do we want to do something that the other government did? And typically, the answer is they're not so keen. But in this case, I have to give Penwire in particular, but many other stakeholders as well, credit, because it was the private sector that went to the new government and said, we support this. We wanted this. We've been advocating for this. This is a great idea. Trust us. You're going to want to do this. It's beneficial to Canada. And oh, by the way, you're going to get to take the credit for it, even though the other group did all the negotiating. So eventually the new government in 2016 got on board with that. And then there was a regulatory process that had to occur. And as we heard in the room there, regulations are not quick. It would be better if they were quicker. And so that entered into force into 2019. And the idea was that there would be some new locations in the coming years, that the existing locations in British Columbia, in ferry and cruise ship and rail would all be able to convert. Well, unexpectedly, 6 months later, major event, COVID-19 pandemic shuts down a lot of cross-border travel, especially initially. The ferries aren't running, the cruise ships aren't running. Clearly, implementation of the new preclearance agreement is going to have to wait. So, there were many moving parts. There were many agencies. There were leadership changes in both countries. But finally, I would say in about 2022 or so, people were able to start resuming discussions on implementation. And now, as you just heard Laurie mention, in 2026, we're just thrilled that there's the first new preclearance airport at Billy Bishop downtown in Toronto, that the Vancouver Rail Amtrak station converted to preclearance. I believe that the cruise ship terminal, Port Metro Vancouver, is going to be fully converting to preclearance later this year. I know that they're working with the ferries in Victoria, and that should be coming in the next couple years. And then the first land preclearance location where Canada would locate in the United States at Cannon Corners, New York. So it's finally all come together. And I guess one of the questions is what, how did we get over that? How did we actually get to the finish line? Because I think there were times where one wondered if that would occur. COVID was challenging in so many ways, but partnerships and persistence. And I think this is where I'm going to draw on what Denis said about the different levels of government, regardless of what's happening at that political level. You had senior government officials, you had operators who really understood what preclearance could bring to the economies of both countries, to the movement of lawful travelers, what it could mean for security. The more that you can clear people in advance, get that advanced passenger information, which we just heard them talk about now in the land environment, and you get that information in advance, people can move more quickly. The officers don't have to look at every person as exactly the same. Most people are legitimate travelers with a traveler history, and why should officers be spending much time with them? Then you can focus the officer's attention. And so also investment by the private sector, the operators who had to make changes to the facilities. It was really a partnership, the provinces, and a shared sense of mission. So the persistence, it took a lot of time. And I I always said I was never going to leave DHS until the preclearance agreement was implemented. So I feel like I kept that. I was one of the only people left at the department who had worked on it from the beginning when I left. And then I'll just quickly, you asked about other items that affect people every day. I would say there was an agreement that was signed in 2012 and then actually modified, renegotiated and modified just a couple years ago, the Visa and Immigration Information Sharing Agreement or treaty in Canada. It does something that is so intuitive that you're all going to be shocked that it didn't exist before we negotiated it. But it said that anyone who was applying for a visa to either the United States or Canada would ping the other country so that Canada would know if someone applying for a visa had already applied to the United States and had received a visa or had been rejected for a visa, maybe because of a criminal history, and then vice versa, right? So the United States would know. How are we not doing this before? This seems so straightforward, but we did negotiate that, and I believe it's something that makes the United States and Canada and all of our populations more secure. And of course, always trying to make improvements to implementation. First, it was biographic, then it was biometric, et cetera.
Shifting gears a little bit on the Whova app, there's a really interesting question about a border threat that's emerging. And you probably dealt with this a lot in terms of whack-a-mole. It's Ebola now, it's a number of different kinds of things coming forward. Listening to Gary Marr earlier evoked the idea of the late Ralph Klein talking about mad cow disease. So the question is as follows. In the Whova, you probably read there's this thing called New World Screwworm. Sounds like a bad word or a bad combination of words, but it's a kind of fly or insect that has disease coming up from South America to Caribbean, hitting New Mexico, Texas, making its way north. Based on your experience in the Canada-US dynamic, any words of wisdom about how emerging threats that rapidly come forward kind of shift the dial, dust things off your desks? How do you deal with those kinds of things?
All right. Great handoff, Deborah. There's always events occurring, right? And so, as you say, whether it's Ebola, it's not the first time that we're having to deal with Ebola. We've had the avian flu. We've had issues where, we're seizing, we used to call it dirty chicken at the border, right? Because it could come into Canada from certain states. And then you have the reverse with Canadian beef. I think the key is always to be working with your agricultural departments in our case. So we work with the CFIA to know what is emerging. And there's people fail to think that, there is an intelligence program in other departments, right? And it's not just about terrorism and what have you. It's about food protection and food safety. It's about health safety and working with, health departments. So that COVID being an example, and understanding what are some of the protective or defensive measures you can put in place, or are there any offensive measures or, advanced steps that you can take to try to deal with it? So it's really about ensuring that not only is there a Canada-US alignment around, knowledge, awareness, and effort, but there's also one domestically in both countries so that you have the perfect or the best, if you will, view of what's transpiring so that you get the direction that you can from those who are the experts in that field around what you should be doing in the border context. And the lens that certainly we would bring to it at CBSA when it was there was, okay, well, how does that get put into practice at the border, and how heavy? I mean, I think in the past, we've talked about how thick is the border. Well, is it going to thicken the border, or is there a way to do it so that it maintains the fluidity that is there now, but also addresses kind of this new emerging risk? So tonight, I'll be asking AI to educate me on screwworm diseases of some sort.
Well, and the same way that CBP and CBSA talk all the time, both at the federal level and at the local level, the regional level, the agriculture officials from both countries are talking all the time, and the health officials from both countries are talking all the time. And so there's an existing network that people could tap into. And I think we've seen with Ebola where the United States imposed some restrictions and then Canada imposed the same restrictions so that we've got consistency. We understand that this is a shared space. And the I think one positive outcome from the COVID-19 experience was much greater collaboration between the border officials in both agencies and the health and agriculture officials in both agencies. They had different approaches. CBP and CBSA very much came from a risk management approach, which is the only way one can function given the volumes of people crossing the border. And the inclination of some of the health agencies was zero risk tolerance. And that being able to meld those two, and I mean, I'm not saying it was easy going, it was a big adjustment, but that had to be incorporated. And I think where both sides came out, you know, I think you would agree with this, is that everyone came out for the better because they started to institutionalize that collaboration in a way that really had not occurred before. And I'd seen a lot of conversations where they were pretty separate silos. So I think we have seen some improvement, whether it's screw worm or whatever else comes up, and there will always be something, to your point, that comes up.
So how do we sort of maintain that? You've both seen a lot over the years. You have a lot of institutional knowledge, a lot of wisdom, but you're no longer in your positions. And there will be this next generation of people that are coming into those roles, looking at the broader relationship. And what would be your advice to them in terms of how they can continue to improve both border efficiency and border security in a collaborative way? Because we have policy agreements, we have relationships, we have institutions. Is it all of these things? Is it sort of a combination of them? What's your advice on that in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's, again, probably a couple of levels. I'd say probably three things. First one is you need to have your established governance and you need to be committed to it. You need to be following it because that will transcend the movement of people through positions. And so when I left, I'd been in my post for 5 years, brought some consistency to it, consistency to the leadership and the direction. And from that, you develop those personal relationships. And so you can call, you know, your US counterpart to say, hey, we have something occurring. Are you able to support? Are you able to provide information? Or we need to do something. I remember on a Saturday night getting a call from Diane Sabatino about a car that kind of flew through the air into a US port of entry, and everybody thinking it was, you know, there was a terrorist attack of some sort occurring.
Casino thing, right? Wasn't it?
Yeah. And, you know, sadly, 2 people lost their lives, but it was a mechanical failure of a vehicle. But like the thing had not even hit the news yet. We're on the phone. And so then we had our operations in Southern Ontario dealing with, you know, an unknown. And so you take your strongest kind of posture. So, but because the relationship had been established and the governance was being followed, and that would nurture those personal relationships, which I think make the day-to-day business easier to manage and richer in terms of, you know, being able to respond quickly. It just, you know, made sure that there was no gap in awareness and knowledge and in collaboration. And my advice to my replacement and future folks who step into the position is do not lose sight of the fact that the governance and the relationships matter at the end of the day. Because, you know, whether it's the shared values for North America around, you know, safe communities, safe security, prosperity, investments, or just the, you know, the safety of folks, that can only be achieved if you know what you're trying to do, who you're trying to do it with, and that you can have those conversations and make sure that there's alignment.
I agree with all that. I would add just a couple points. What I would say to someone, what I have said to people, because there are people, a couple still left in my office, try. People make a difference. Nothing happens if you don't put in the work. Aim high, be creative, solicit ideas. Don't worry about who takes the credit. Do the work. And if you don't do it, it doesn't get done. But you don't do it alone. You will not succeed doing it alone. It takes a team. It takes those relationships. And you have to be persistent. You heard, you know, preclearance and many other examples. It takes 5-10 years sometimes to get something over the finish line, but then it makes a real difference to people and to people's lives and people's travel and people's safety. And I think the other thing that I tell people is don't lose sight of the goal. Don't lose sight of the desired outcome. There is so much churn that comes at you when you're in the government. There are so many daily, quote, in quotes, crises. Some of them are real, some of them are not. They're sort of manufactured crises, but it's very easy to drown in the churn. And you have to be able to manage that at the same time that you stay focused on your long-term goals, because that's what's going to move the ball forward. That's what's going to make the difference. And you reach out to anyone that you can and work with anyone that you can that can help move the ball forward, because it really does take a lot of different voices and a lot of consistent efforts, but then you can make a difference. And so I, try to leave people, with that lesson.
It's a great lesson. And I think it's easy to focus on what's not working at the border, but there are so many things that are working. And a lot of those things came out of the efforts that you two had put into place. So thank you. We have a question from.
Yeah. Alex asked a really good question around, it's clear that the border cooperation is strong. And certainly from your reflections, we've got, however, an issue with how do you deal with the onslaught of media stories similar to Nina Patel's comments around it's good that we were getting a lot of attention in terms of border issues, but any advice you could provide on that point?
Yeah, I could use that advice as well.
I mean, never miss an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis. And if there's more funding, you have to be ready to seize the moment. And you were ready. And I know working Canada issues at the Department of Homeland Security, I'm not going to say that was always front and center, but we were ready. We had the ideas, we had done our homework. And when there were opportunities and we had new leadership or an event would occur and someone would say, who's the Canada person? What are give me some stuff, right? You have to be ready. And I think what CBSA is doing and what CPP are doing, taking advantage of the influx of resources, the one big, beautiful bill, and on your end, all the investments, deploying that technology, hiring the officers that we know need to be hired. But I also, one reason I have a piece of paper is so I could read this quote. I want to read the quote from the current Secretary of Homeland Security. In mid-June, he was in Washington, D.C., in an event at the Center for Security and National Studies with the public safety minister. And he said, there's a tremendous amount of love and trust that still exists between the United States and Canada. When push comes to shove, even though we may disagree on stuff, when they need us or we need them, we've always been there. And that doesn't change. We'll continue to do that. We can't allow fractures to take place and to grow. Some of the fracturing we have right now between the countries, we've got to figure it out because we're not going anywhere and they're not going anywhere. And so what we have to do is quit focusing on our differences and start thinking about what we have in common. And I just thought those were terrific comments. They're comments that every single secretary that I worked for at the department, permanent or acting, would have said. And I think it was great to see him make those remarks.
That's a great point, right? It's about being frank, like call a spade a spade. And that's one of the things that when you're dealing with media, just because you yell the loudest does not make you right. And a great headline will draw people to, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Vancouver Herald, or whoever. So my advice was always like, let's tell them what we're doing. They're going to find out at some point. But we're going to say, now you have to do this. Now you have to do that. COVID measure, and the COVID rules were changing monthly, right? So educate people. We're not out there trying to hide things, but there's a fear of failure. There's a fear of, giving too much, fueling a fire, which to me instills, or provides, if you will, fuel to the fire out in that void of space where you're not active. In Canada, certainly through COVID, I became kind of the spokesperson, the face. I was doing the media interviews, and I did not shy away from it. There was very few mics I haven't liked, standing in front of. And so, but the idea was just be frank and let people know and let them ask all the questions that they want. Otherwise, if that void exists, someone's going to fill it, and it's not necessarily going to be to your liking. And, just as an observation, there's a lot of activism in Canada. There probably is in the US. Government employee unions are very vocal about return to work and things of that nature. If you don't respond and you don't, give your version and be honest about it, they're gonna take advantage of that, and that becomes the public perception of the reality. So to me, it's just be out there, be open, don't shy away, and build that trust with people. You're not hiding behind smoke screens or behind the walls.
So we're moving into our wrap up, but I want to give you each like 30 seconds, maybe at the most, to just say, what are you most proud of that you worked on, whether it's a specific initiative or the way you did your job or the relationships? What would you point to as sort of the thing that you take away most from all of the years that you gave to the government?
Well, I used to call the Beyond the Border initiative my third child. So I'm pretty proud of that because it continued for a long time and we achieved almost everything that we set out to do, which was pretty remarkable. I think some of the things that were quiet, like the deployment of entry-exit at land border ports of entry together, no one talked about that. You know why? Because it went well. It didn't affect travelers, but it solved a problem for both countries. The deployment of simplified arrival, the biometrics at the preclearance airports. I just connected in Toronto last month on my way to Calgary. I couldn't believe it. I walked up, they took a picture, the officer said, go ahead. It was incredible. It was not easy to get that deployed. So I think if you didn't hear about it, that meant that we did our jobs well. And there are a lot of good news stories. And Ambassador Hoekstra said it this morning. We do a lot well together. Let's talk about that. As Denis said, it's a good story.
Maybe two quick ones. First one, from just a personal gratification perspective, Canada's response on my role and my team's role in the 2010 Haiti earthquake. And so Canada decided to fast track a lot of applications to bring Haitians to Canada, people who were affected by it. And just being there and seeing from a humanitarian perspective what we in the US do in the world when we welcome refugees and others who are seeking help. And the same with Syrian. We had an Operation Syrian Refugee, which we brought 50,000, which became, I think, almost 150,000 once it was all said and done. And I was in Montreal, and this family comes off, and they'd never been on a plane before. And this little 5-year-old walks up to me, and he had a little Canada paper flag, and he looked up at me, and I'm standing there in uniform because I wanted to see how the whole process worked. And he walked up to me, couldn't speak English or French. I certainly couldn't speak their language. And out came the little hand, and he just kind of gave me the hand. I'm looking at this kid, and like my heart melted. So, what we do matters. It matters not only to investments and trade, but it matters globally. Canada and the US are seen as leaders in that space. And in closing, from a technology perspective, just being able to secure big funding for traveler modernization that others are now carrying and will see the light of day, so that the traveler experience and the officer experience in Canada will look different. And hopefully when you cross the border in the future, nobody will speak to you because we will have done our work. We will confirm your identity through a digital travel credential or a biometric camera, and you will just go to the curb, grab your bags, and head off to Whistler or what have you. So very proud of the fact that CBSA, I think, is in good hand with funding and direction for the future.
On that note, please have a round of applause for our panel. And before we wrap up, I'm going to call upon my colleague Samir Ismail to come up to the podium in terms of doing a quick recap. Samir's been working pen to paper, summarizing a lot of what has been advanced in terms of the FIFA set of stakeholder workshops, working closely with Matt Brandon and others, as well as Tara. You can never forget about the role Tara has at Penware. Over to you, Samir.
Thanks, Solomon. So hi everyone, my name is Samir Ismail, a consultant at InterVISTAS. So thank you all for such a rich set of discussions today. I wanted to talk about the top 3 things that really stood out to me. First is that the Pacific Northwest has really pioneered innovation on the Canada-US border. And a lot of the new ideas that have really improved the border have come from this region. So we have more preclearance than any other region in North America. The CBP is piloting new technologies on biometrics here in our region first, as Brittny said. And we should make this the region that champions innovation into the future as well. The second thing is that the border is driven by people and the relationships between them. So Deborah and Denis, you both talked about the strength of your personal relationships that really influenced how your work on the border evolved, and the importance of institutionalizing that relationship down into something where all practitioners at the border are effectively able to actually know their colleagues across on the other side. And then putting a governance structure around that. And these relationships are ultimately what's going to maintain the bigger relationship between our two countries. And the third thing was that the border should not impede our economic growth. I'm going to steal Nina's line there in saying that improving the border actually has economic benefits. It creates a better first impression when visitors land in Canada and the United States. That was something that we heard throughout our FIFA stakeholder workshops, was that we wanted a positive visitor experience when you first arrive and see the border. And we can do this while meeting safety and security objectives. And the fact that our border agencies are actually empowered to take calculated risks in this way is an opportunity to innovate. So we shouldn't doubt our ability to work at speed when we need to innovate, but we also want to make sure we tell the right story so that we can get the political will and the funding to see the changes that we actually want to see in the industry going forward. And we need the private sector and we need provincial and state partners to tell that story with us. So just in wrapping up, I want to highlight one of the next steps that our team at InterVISTAS is going to take on this topic, and that is studying the future of trusted traveler programs, particularly in the case of Canada, but also examining what's in the US and jurisdictions around the world. So trusted travelers programs include things like Nexus, Global Entry, FAST, and some less known programs too, like the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Business Travel Card. So the objective would be to support an environment where frequent travelers can have a faster, more convenient, more consistent, and more seamless border crossing experience. So one of our first steps is a discussion paper, and this is where we'd like your help. So if you've worked with trusted traveler programs, you've experienced them yourself as a policymaker, an operator, just someone who's crossing the border, if you have a view on what we should consider in there, definitely welcome your thoughts. I'm more than happy to hear all of the comments that you have. So you can reach out to Denis, Vinette, you can reach out to myself, you can reach out to Solomon. All of us would be happy to take your input. I'll be around for the rest of the conference, and we'll make sure to exchange some ideas. So thank you again to Nina, Brittny, Denis, Deborah, Solomon, Laurie, for all of your insights, and enjoy the rest of the summit, everyone.